Okay, so just to give you a bit of context as to why we decided to put this panel on. So the idea behind this panel was really to bring together a diverse range of people working in a broad range of sectors to really showcase the multifaceted aspect of climate justice. As I'm sure many of you are aware, our climate crisis is not a distant issue. People are already dying, people are already being displaced from their homes, nations are going underwater, people are suffering, and it's those that have contributed the least that are suffering the most. So those nations in the global south, women, people from low-income households, indigenous peoples, and those with disabilities are the most affected, yet the least responsible. So it's really about how do we navigate this pathway to climate justice, knowing that it's not just one simple solution. We've got to approach it from multiple different angles. And so in this discussion, we're going to be delving into what roads can come together to join on this pathway to climate justice and get some insights from the experts themselves. So to kick off the panel, I would just like to open up the discussion to invite each of our presenters to tell us a little bit about how they're working towards climate justice in their own work at the moment and in their various sectors. So Amandine, would you like to kick us off, please?
Sure, that's working. Hi everyone. I was asked to think about how our work on systems change relates to climate justice. And I thought I would highlight three different themes, one around increased ambition, one around broadened focus, and one around increased inclusivity and collaboration. In terms of increased ambition, one of the things that I think has been really important to increase climate justice is the increased confidence to make bold commitments without knowing how. I started at ClimateWorks 11 years ago now, and when I started, the kind of targets that we were seeing in climate action were very much built bottom up. What did people think they could achieve with the technologies that they knew about, the costs that they were comfortable with, and so on and so forth. Then a few years later, there started being a movement that moved towards actually incremental thinking is not going to get us where we need to be. That's just not going to be sufficient. When it comes to the carbon budget, it's really about getting rid of emissions. So really it's about working backwards from net zero. We call that, in more technical terms, backcasting from that end outcome of net zero emissions. So there was this big movement that moved towards pushing that long-term thinking, pushing that how can we do things in a way that will remove emissions eventually from the economy. And then more recently, there's been more evidence that showed the impact of 1.5 degrees. How much bigger they would be. It's an exponential change, if you want, in many areas between 2 degrees and 1.5. And Sophie just mentioned, the awareness of the impact that climate change is going to have on the poorest populations and so on. And as that awareness increased, there was an accelerated push to, well, it's not enough to achieve net zero, it matters how fast we achieve it. And it should be about 1.5. And with that shift, there's been that increased confidence to be like, okay, well, we don't really know how to do net zero. We can see it in some sectors, but not in all. Okay, let's do it. And then 1.5, it's again a more ambitious goal. Nobody's got any idea how we're going to achieve it. But we're seeing increasingly organizations, like corporates, finance, governments, thinking about, well, we don't know how, but we want to commit to it and we want to work as hard as possible towards it. And that increased confidence to just jump in the unknown. So the other theme that I wanted to talk about was that broadened focus. So we are a climate organization. Typically we've been focused on achieving net zero emission, that's in our mission. But recently we've seen that you can't just do that without looking at other aspects. I mean, that would be pretty obvious to most of you. But we've really tried in our research and our implementation work to think about what are some of those other aspects that are really important. For example, if you're going to be looking at how can we develop a net zero transport system, it's not just about how you're going to remove the emissions from the technologies, but it's also about how we actually create a system that's more inclusive, that increase accessibility to economic opportunities and other things. How are we going to build a system that improves well-being of inhabitants and things like that, and really trying to have that broadened idea of what you're trying to build. We're doing that as well in our land work, as environmental aspects across many different dimensions are really important. That's also something that's important to think about when you look at implementation. We're just talking with colleagues, for example, about when it comes to climate finance, it's not just about getting the money and getting it deployed, but how it gets deployed is really critical. Can you deploy it in a way that is not going to entrench injustice in the countries where you're deploying that money? For example, can you do it in a way that is where it's not going to go to the 1% richest of the companies, but rather, support local small enterprises, support local economic opportunities, do it in a way that is inclusive and delivers other benefits. And finally, my last theme was around increased inclusivity and collaboration. So we started as a more traditional think tank where we'd do, for example, some research, we consulted a few experts, and then we'd go and engage a range of stakeholders into our research. But recently, we've been moving to a more collaborative approach where instead of creating the solutions ourselves, we actually convene a range of stakeholders and together build a common vision and build common solutions. We've found that to be really important. It takes more effort than doing the research yourself and creating a report about it, but it has so many benefits. One of them is that at the same time as we develop the solutions, you really build that deep understanding in the stakeholders that you're talking to. But also the solutions that you're building are more robust if you can include those diverse perspectives from the get-go in the solution development, in the definition of the vision, and so on and so forth. And another aspect that we find quite important is that by convening those stakeholders and getting them to talk together, you're also creating those connections and relationships that are going to actually make the change stick and make the change sustainable. So that's probably familiar to a lot of you, but I just wanted to highlight those things. We are pretty early in our systems change transition, and doing a little plug for, I'm going to be doing a workshop after this session where we're going to talk a bit about our early experience, and I'm hoping to have a discussion with the people in this room who have already done this transition, are doing it, are thinking about doing it, and thinking about some of the challenges and the learnings from that.
Amazing. Thank you, Amandine. Terence, would you like to go next, please?
Thanks, Sophie. So just to follow on from Amandine, so my work through EY is mostly focused on private and public sectors and transitioning them, but we do work across other areas, not just climate, so human rights, sustainability, ESG, and social impact areas as well. So if I look at, I guess, the work that we're doing and how that's moving the sector forward, if I look about 10 years ago and where we're now, we've got a lot of the listed corporate sector reporting on their performance publicly, which does place a level of, I guess, accountability on them to continue to improve on their performance. So that's a positive. If I look at net zero transition and greenhouse targets, about 25% of the ASX 200 have net zero targets, about 50% have greenhouse targets. So again, that's a bit of progress, but I'd probably say, well, where's the other 75%? So there's some way to go still. I think the big issue for the private sector here is the uncertainty that the political environments provided, with the certainty that it hasn't provided in terms of transition, because I think the technology is here, the will is here, employees, certainly every company that we speak to tells us that employees want to work for progressive, sustainable companies. And so the leadership is committed, but if you don't see the certainty in terms of where you're going to head from a climate point of view, it makes it really hard. So you look at a company like NBN or Woolworths or Coles, they'll all come out and say they're going to be 100% renewable by 2025. Now, they don't need to be. They, I guess, are working in this sort of space where the renewables are coming through the pipeline and they can make commitments and they can move to renewables. But if that certainty was there in terms of renewables targets or red targets, or if there were price incentives, I think that could have been all of the companies, not just 3 or 4 that are going to be 100% renewable by 2025. So that's a bit of an issue. I think I was saying to Anand, looking at COP, with a positive voice here, I might be slightly more subdued. It wasn't, to me, the most sort of urgent call for action given where we are. If you look at the sort of state that we're in from a climate point of view, we're at 1.1 degrees heading to 1.2. Australia is disproportionately warmer, so we're at about 1.4 degrees already. As the world will hit 1.5 at least once this decade. So 1.5 is sort of within reach, and with climate COP going, well, we're going to be somewhere between 1.8 and 2.4. And for India and China and so on to not commit to 2050, at least for now. Emily says they will soon. But it just doesn't make any sense to me, logically, to put 2 billion lives into climate risk for those two countries not to commit and not to urge the rest of the planet to move forward. When the consequences are pretty clear, the modeling's there, the technology's here, and it's really around the will and the financial commitment that needs to be there. So Australia, being a rich country that it is, and having per capita contributed much more than the rest of the world, we're definitely not pulling our weight, and the political certainty will, I think, get us to pull our weight a lot quicker, and hopefully that comes. So far it's still a long way to go. All the companies that we work with tend to be quite progressive, even the oil and gas companies. I think the other things that are pushing them forward are investors. So investors saying to companies and taking ESG into account in the way they decide whether they invest or not. So surveys by EY says that 98% of investors globally get and analyze ESG data and use that in their investment decision making. 72% use it to inform sort of structured decision making, i.e. analytics go into their decision. So investors are there. Litigation is another thing that's moving companies forward. So we've got a number of cases that have happened, a number of cases that are currently happening, like Santos and CBA. And that's got directors worried, it's got executives worried, and there's certainly, legal cases that are going to move things forward, US, Europe, and here. So there are other drivers, and it's not just corporate social responsibility, but I think more political certainty at the federal level. The state level is pretty good, but at the federal level will make it a lot easier for private sector to move forward.
Amazing, thank you, Terence. Nova, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this, please.
Well, I'm not a scientist or anything. I don't have any of that background. But as an Aboriginal person, I guess I speak from a very practical level in terms of going out to country and sitting down with the old people and seeing the impact that climate change has had on us up in Arnhem Land region. The environment and the lowering of billabongs and all that sort of stuff that I'm sure everyone is aware of. But I guess, why am I here and in what capacity do I talk? So when I was living here in Melbourne, I worked for Melbourne Water, I feel that they're quite a progressive organisation, and they are in the process of getting their cultural fire plan, which they did a significant amount of consultation work with the traditional owners here in Victoria to come up with their cultural burning plan. And so I had the privilege of meeting an incredible Aboriginal man from the Cape called Victor Stephenson, who heads up the National Indigenous Fire Sticks Alliance, which I'm the national patron for. I guess, my mob extended from the Kimberleys and also the West Arnhem Land region, where 3/4 of my family are rangers and on country. They're not on the land, they're in the sea. So I have an enormous amount of respect and I guess not only just respect, but I see the significant amount of importance for it. And when the fires hit here in Victoria and New South Wales a couple of years ago, we all know that there was a federal inquiry into the fires, and what was at the forefront was Victor Stephenson. He was sort of rolled out, and he was talking about the importance of Aboriginal people caring for country. Because when we care for country, we care for country for all people. And I sort of feel that when you value and you respect us, you have to value and respect our history and our profound love of this country. We're not fleeing, we're not running away. We have inherent responsibilities to be able to do that. And so, there's a lot of, I guess, discussion around, the climate change and the fires and all that. But when you look deeper, it's because country hasn't been cared for. We haven't been allowed back onto country, and I sort of feel, I spoke about it yesterday, the whole terra nullius notion, that comes along with valuing and respecting us as humans, but valuing and respecting that inherent knowledge that has been passed on about looking after country. So I'm here in that capacity, how many times do you have to keep shouting from the hilltops to say, the country, when I look at fire and I look at water, they're two same things. You need fire to rehabilitate country, you need fire for the animals, you need fire in so many ways and forms. So in that aspect, I will champion it, I will continue to scream from the hilltops on the importance of rangers and in caring for country. I know the Kimberleys mob up there have been going to Africa, Botswana. People can research that, how our knowledge is being utilised in other countries before it's even being utilised here in this country. So that's what I'm extremely passionate about. I know that when you are caring for it, everything in its external forms is part of that whole holistic system. The other things I spoke yesterday about my foundation, food security is a big problem, not just for us as Aboriginal people, but all of Australians. And I partnered with an amazing company called Food Ladder. So these food security systems, agriculture technology, the technology's out there, but we need to utilise it more. There's up in the Northern Territory, we've had issues with the soil, the banana freckle or whatever they call it, and they just wipe out the entire plantation without thinking, okay, well, what's next? How can we move? What's the advancement of technology? So these food securities, especially old people, are like, well, can we bring back the old bush medicine, and can we bring back the old food that we used to eat? Absolutely we can. So it's being able to use modern technology with ancient ways. So I'm all for the water efficiency. One thing that I'd like to ask these guys here, there's a big discussion about this organisation called the Sun Cable that wants to build the biggest solar farm in the world to the advancement of solar energy and send it to Indonesia. How does that work? And my question is, what do they do? How long does a solar panel last? And what do they do when it doesn't last anymore? Where does the landfill and... So that's a question that maybe I can have a bit later on. But, we've lived here for 50,000 plus years, and we're not going to live a lot more if we don't take care of Mother Earth. And I think it's a responsibility of everyone. And the politicians are there, I was one of them, but I was always for caring for country, but they're there because we put them there. So when we go to the polls and we want to make sure that we're part of progressing country for everyone to sustain. We are here on borrowed time for our future generations.
Thank you, Nova.
Yeah, thank you to each of the panelists. They were incredible answers. What was the question again, Sophie?
It's just talking about the work that you're doing at the moment towards climate justice. So just an overview of where you're at and your projects.
Yeah, true. Okay, that's an interesting one. I do quite a lot I kind of live my values, which are the permaculture ethics, care of people, care of earth, and limits to growth, which my grandfather brought me up on the farm in Tasmania, which was a really big humbling honour to kind of plant a forest and grow up with that too. So that instilled me with the values to travel overseas and do a lot of international, humanitarian work, which I'm still involved with, be it on Zoom, but I hope to get back over there soon. But I'm involved with the Afghan humanitarian settlement program here in Melbourne. So there's 1,500 Afghans that have arrived in Melbourne in the last 6 weeks. We've been supporting through food relief, through culturally appropriate vegan and plant-based meals, groceries, packs, and now we're doing programs with them, bringing them into the garden at their request and working with the community leaders in there to achieve some incredible stories, but it's inside. But again, it's just so amazing to have that connection in the room with them, to connect in person with them. I think that's a lot of what we've lost over COVID, is that interpersonal skills as well. So it's nice to be able to bring that back and go into the hotels and, and just hear and listen with them and provide them with that space too. And I'm working a lot in the energy justice space, so making sure it's a just transition to a renewable future, so making sure low-income renters, asylum seekers don't get left behind in the multi-million or billion-dollar renewable transition, which gets lost a lot in the political announcements. And I'll go to my local federal member or my state member or local council and go, look, it's a great project you're announcing, but where's the equity for the people that can't afford to buy their own house, or because of the housing affordability crisis and the homelessness that's occurring. So out of the food relief kitchen in Brunswick, we do food relief to Federation Square 2 nights a week to people still sleeping rough through COVID there, and a lot of mental health support too. But we're doing emergency food relief out in Colorama where there was a lot of wind damage and houses without power, so we're doing food relief out there for a couple of weeks. While still doing COVID pandemic food relief in Melbourne and the Afghan food relief. So over the 6 lockdowns, we've been doing quite a lot of different food relief and program development and online cooking classes, and it's been an amazing growth period for the organisation. And it's just going to keep getting better and better because we practice our values every day and we really embody them in who we are and the conversations we have and how we listen to people, engage with the community too.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Stu. And we'll touch on a bit more of your good news in a little moment. I just want to expand on this idea of policy. Terence, you mentioned that many organisations were waiting for that policy certainty in much of their net zero emissions commitments. And as Nova mentioned, Indigenous populations around the world have lived in harmony with the natural environment for tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years and lived sustainably, and their worldview is so intertwined with the functionings of nature, and yet our Indigenous peoples are not able to make those policy-making decisions. They don't have a seat at the table. So I want to ask you, Nova, you've had experience, obviously, being a former senator and being a First Nations woman. I would love to hear your experience advocating for policy change from your perspective and how effective you think it will be towards actually achieving climate justice, given the current policy climate and lack of representation of First Nations peoples.
federal parliament, which is fantastic. And there's a lot of extremely strong voices in there as well. Sadly, what I found in politics is, what you're up against, the lobbyist groups or those who are big donors to political parties that sway the directions of policies, unfortunately. But I think, we just have to, it's people power, and I think that's what really we need to get stronger at. And, when we're out in the streets or you're protesting on the lawns of Parliament House, and I think bringing, like our children now are getting quite politically savvy as well, and it's really good to see a lot of the youth out there talking about, well, this is our law, this is the future, So that's how we have to start thinking. We can't just continue to live in the now all the time. And, like you just said, that sadly that's what you're up against. You're up against the big lobbyist groups, the mining companies and the hotel industries, and, money talks. It's the root of all evil as well. But it is what it is, and we've just got to get better at that, because the investment in life, you can't put a dollar value on a human value. And I think that's the way we need to start talking. I think I'm an optimistic person. The glass is always half full to me. And the more that we speak, the more times we're talking about it, the more times we're out there protesting and lobbying for it. That's all we can do. Because unfortunately, sometimes what I found, people are quite happy with themselves at times. Their egos, unfortunately, get the better of them. Let's be honest here. It's not holding them and getting shots, but it is what it is. And just empowering and supporting those people who are truth speakers that hold political seats.
Absolutely, and that's, I think, a great segue to go back to Stu, talking about people power and grassroots and building community and working from the bottom up. Stu, would you like to talk a little bit about your experience with that and affecting policy from the ground up?
Yeah, I'm really passionate about working with a lot of different grassroots community groups and kind of getting a whole collection of community groups. I might be working with 30 different grassroots groups at the moment around just the issue of renewable energy, but then coming up with big power groups so we can buy the megawatts of energy the retailers can, come up with our own energy cooperative and redistribute that out at a cheaper rate, and building energy justice and renewable energy into that at 17 cents a kilowatt hour as opposed to the retail 27, which means is a huge transformative thing to get grassroots groups together for that collective buying power. And I think that's what the power of grassroots is. When you come together, you're an unstoppable force, inspirational, and no politician or policy can stop you, because there's power in number and there's unity in a cause. And when we have that guiding star of climate change, it moves something deep in us, something soulful that we all have to come together to fight for this planet, because it's beautiful and it's our home. And we love it, we love each other and our families. But when we're passionate and we cause and we have a vision and we come together, we can really achieve something beautiful and amazing. And it's not something in the future, it's happening right now at this very minute, at this very conference. And it's been happening as a living movement in Melbourne for years and years and years, and it's something to be quite proud of, to stand up and celebrate, to talk about and go, I'm actually proud to be leading the change to the future we want to create. And the politicians can come along for the ride if they want to. We don't need their permission to design our future. I think there's real power in that message.
Thank you, Stu. And I think that also reiterates the point that Irfan made this morning in his keynote, talking about building our lives around service and not just, doing our 9-to-5 jobs and going home, but really advocating for social justice and community and building the fabric of society in all elements of our lives, not just for work. So I just want to ask Terence again, what are your thoughts on the role of business in working towards climate justice? How would you describe this kind of tension between businesses taking responsibility. Like you've got some leaders like Patagonia, for example, who are really setting the standard and setting the bar high versus relying on people power and the pressure of us to shift organizations and to demand more and expect more from them. How would you see that role of business? And do you think it's more business, or do you think it's more consumer responsibility at this stage?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think you've got to start by looking at whether the business model is right. So I guess a typical business at the moment is a shareholder-led private company that's listed. And as a consequence, you've got the investor pressure to have quarterly earnings updates and quarterly, I guess, market cap growth updates. So, you want your share price going up and you want your profit going up. How do you do that? You do that by selling more and more. And how do you sell more and more? You try and advertise more and more and encourage people to buy more and get rid of more. Most things that we buy end up in landfill within 6 months, 90% of it. So it's a sort of frightening business environment. 200 years ago, none of that was happening, and people were still happy. So we kind of need to think about, well, do we need to keep listening to business and buy more to be happy? Because that's really what the cycle is. And that's what consumers are being driven to do, is to say, well, if you look at any advertising, it's about happy people buying things in order to be happy and just consuming and continue to consume and then buying lots of medicine to look after yourself because you become really unhealthy if you eat a lot of bad food and meat. So in that sort of cycle, you then think about, well, what are the other business models? So you've got sort of purpose-led B Corp movement, and yes, I think that's a better business model than a shareholder-led private company. The other one that has lost a lot of flavour over the years, but I think we're going to start looking at again, is member-based cooperative and mutual businesses. So something like a Bank Australia or an NRMA or RACB, where you don't have shareholders demanding quarterly earnings, you have members. And, if you're a RACB member, you're paying for a service, but you own RACB. So start to think about, well, how do you sort of revitalise? That's kind of where business started. Business started with communities owning an enterprise. So how do we go back there where the business is owned by the members who are receiving the services, but therefore looking after the business because they're receiving essential service from it. So I do think we've got to revisit the current business model. But if we then say, well, if we stay with the current business model, what does business need to do? So I think the right to repair is something that's starting to get flavour. So there's French have introduced right to repair legislation. It just means that if you buy a mobile phone from Apple has to give you the right to be able to repair, i.e. the service provision to be able to repair it and keep it, and not have obsolescence built into it. So I think that movement has to pick up. The business has to look at how to drive products up the value pyramid, i.e. instead of trying to sell a $20 drill, which is going to break after 6 goes, sell a $120 drill that's going to last 20 years and you can pass on to your kids. So you've got to try and drive the products up the value pyramid. I also think you've got to look at recycling and reuse industries. How do we sort of take things, fix them? And that's starting to happen in the mobile phone world, for example. You can buy second-hand phones and they do continue life, but why can't you do that every other device instead of going down the e-waste track? So I think there are, Patagonia is a really good example, but Patagonia is where business needs to drive itself, but it's so far away from everything that you learn at uni and MBA classes and marketing schools that it's a whole cultural shift that you've got to go through. I mean, it's really interesting if you start to look at the sort of things that we have to unlearn. It's amazing. Like, you know, GPs saying, if you stop drinking milk, where are you getting your calcium from? And if you've got that sort of society, how do you sort of rewind from there? We weren't drinking milk 6,000 years ago, and you don't need milk, but suddenly milk has become the most important thing in terms of bones, and it's all marketing. But that's just one example. That's across everything.
Yeah, thank you so much. And love how you touched on that consumerist issue that we've got at the moment, and how it's very difficult to achieve climate justice if all we're striving for is to produce more and to use more resources and to keep building our GDP. And I think that point really relates well to yesterday's discussion panel on economics. So definitely some room to explore in that sense. Finally, Amandine, I just want to ask you a question. I don't want to delve too deeply into the topic of your next session, but I just wanted you to give us all a little bit of an intro or a little overview, I guess, of the work that you're doing at ClimateWorks around systems change and really changing your business model to look through a more holistic lens. Would you be able to give a brief overview, please?
Sure, and maybe to not duplicate completely what I'm going to be saying afterwards, I'll focus on something that's a bit relevant to what we were just talking about, which is one of the things that we've been looking at is where, as an organization, can we intervene to try and get the most impact for our efforts. And that's what we talk about, trying to find leverage points in kind of systems theory. And, relevant to some of the things we talked about, one way to find a leverage point, if you think about policy, for example, not waiting for the federal government, for example, to make a great policy, but finding ways to try and create like a positive feedback loop or a race to the top. So in the absence of federal leadership in the last few years, for example, it's been about trying to find other leaders that are going to be able to set that standard that then others can follow. And we found this to be a really, really powerful intervention recently. So trying to find leaders in business, in finance, in state governments that are willing to take a step up and make a commitment that is better than anybody else right now. And then that sets the norm. That sets the social norm, that sets peer pressure, and then you see suddenly like the expectation raising and that really creating that positive feedback loop. So that's been one of the things that we've been looking at. How can we identify some of these opportunities to create positive feedback loops? You've got others, for example, in technology investment. If you actually invest at scale in some of the new technologies, then that creates a positive loop where the technologies become cheaper, less risky, and so on and so forth. So we've seen that with renewables. We're now seeing, we've seen that with batteries. We're seeing that with, hydrogen, renewable hydrogen, and things like that. Another thing that we've been looking at is, it's the elusive shifting mental models of people. They're shifting people's mindsets that can really be, it goes beyond, making them understand that they need to act on climate and really trying to understand what are their mindsets that are currently blocking, ambitious action on climate. And for example, one of the things that I think most people would be familiar with is that climate action has typically been portrayed as a cost. It's like, how much does it cost us to invest in this? How much does it cost the economy? How many jobs is it going to cost? And so on. And actually being able to reframe that in a different light and be able to show that actually acting on climate is going to create a lot of benefits. Economic, certainly, but other benefits. And recently, for example, we've seen that there's been a pretty big change in narrative in Australia with this idea of Australia potentially becoming a renewable superpower, where Australia could be one of the leaders globally in manufacturing renewable hydrogen, manufacturing green metals, green steel, green aluminum, which could create prosperity for the country, and being able to actually substantiate this narrative and show to people that there's a positive future where Australia decarbonizes really helps changing some of those blocking mindsets, especially of on the politics side, to get more bipartisanship, and also on the industrial side. The large, for example, oil and gas company, a lot of them, it was a bit like either our model survives or we have no future. Whereas now there's actually an alternative where those companies can see a transition to a positive future, and it removes like really big blockers to action. Some of I'm not going to talk about all of them, but there's other things like governance, thinking about how can you embed some of those objectives in your governance and your rules and things like that. But anyway, I'll probably stop here.
Thank you so much. So many different avenues through which we could approach the issue of climate justice. So thank you all for... Oh yeah, Terence, do you want to add something?
Can I just quickly answer Nova's question about the sun cable?
Oh yeah, go for it. I forgot about that.
So it's a couple of, I guess, observations or thoughts around it. So there's enough sunlight that falls on Earth in one day to power the whole of the world for a whole year, right? So there's plenty of solar power, and there's two export opportunities if we take Amandine's point about renewable superpower for Australia. One is the sun cable type approach, and the second is hydrogen and exporting hydrogen. And Australia having the land mass that it does, we have a lot of solar power falling here. We've also got lots of wind, lots of wave, so plenty of renewables. So we should be taking advantage of it. In terms of PVs and solar farms, I think, Nova, the sort of life cycle impact of looking at a PV panel versus the greenhouse emissions and the landfill costs, it is sort of much in favour of the greenhouse emissions that it's reducing. But the other thing that is continuing to be worked on is the continuation of those panels. So in a solar farm context, what they do is they continue to maintain and repair the panels, which is why the solar industry creates a lot more jobs than the coal industry. So if you think about jobs in the Northern Territory, I think there's going to be a lot more jobs created through solar farms and maintenance of solar panels than going down the current track that we are, burning diesel and things like that. So sun cable is recognised sort of by the feds now as a highly potential project in terms of export, and it's got Mark Cannon Brooks and others behind it with a lot of money. So I think it's got lots of potential. But I mean, it just shows the ability that we have and what we're blessed with in terms of what we've already got. Yes, we've got lots of coal, but we've also got lots of transition potential and lots of job opportunities to transition.
Thank you so much for that explanation. And thank you to all of our panellists. Unfortunately, we're...